Okay, so this is an effort here to go through the big ideas in the A5 section on being Native in Canada. I've tried to word the questions here from the curriculum. Each of these questions comes from the curriculum guide. I've tried to kind of rework the wording of them so that they're not so confusing, but this recording should help walk you through so that you'll be able to listen to a response to one and then press pause maybe, come up with your response, listen to the next, and on like that. So really, the questions here relate to what place do First Nations people have in Canada? What place should they have compared to what place do we think they actually have, and is that right and fair? And it's just some questions that are intended to kind of help you think about the topic and what your personal beliefs might be in response to the questions. And then hopefully the literature that you're studying through this section will also challenge and stretch those personal beliefs. That's the goal behind the work that you're doing here. So the first one here asks, how are Aboriginal multicultural perspectives in Canada collected and represented by their artists and authors? So how is the question? How are their stories, histories represented, or to what extent are they included in the larger conversation on the national level? So the first part of this you might question and consider here is, how are they represented? In what ways do you see them in your communities? They might be First Nations athletes. It might be a few First Nations musicians or things like that. I can think of a group that's a tribe called Red that has kind of more of a popular following with mainstream society. I could think of a few particular authors who are significant enough that they have a very broad reading base. It's not just people that are First Nations background, but they're accepted as authors just kind of as a Canadian author and not necessarily specifically as a First Nations author. So when we're talking about how are their stories, their perspectives included, that would be through things like culture. It would be through literature. It would be through media. It would be things like videos, films, documentaries, music, art. I can think of, for example, the Haida community is on the western coast in BC, and you would recognize the style of art. It's specific to one region in Canada, but it's kind of accepted and used as a representation of just kind of Canadian First Nations influence. There's a big monument or a mural of Haida focus, I think, in, say, the Calgary airport. Well, that's far enough away from the BC community whose art it is specific to. So at times we use this as tokens, and so that's kind of related to this question here. How are their stories represented, or to what extent are they included? Are they included as tokens? And what I mean by that, is it just a check mark that we've included them because someone has regulated that they need to be included in X amount of media or in our school system? Do you think that it's an inclusion of their ideas and history as tokens, or is it more of a natural inclusion? Are they just part of the Canadian story, and do they naturally share and are they naturally received by Canadian readers, music lovers and things like that? So how are their perspectives represented by their artists? So through a number of different methods here. And to what extent are they included? Are they included just to check off something because we're supposed to include them, or are they included in a natural way? Question number 2 asks whether or not First Nations people and non-First Nations people have a shared group value as Canadians. What are our values as Canadians? And I guess you'd have to start with that. What are the Canadian values? And you might assume that they are the things that we have protected with the Charter, the freedoms that exist, the sense of equality, the sense of expression, beliefs, a lot of the things that we have fought and we have laws that protect. These things are what we value. So then the question is, do Aboriginal people value these things as much as non-Aboriginal people? Do they have other values that are unique to them and their community, that are maybe different from the other population? I might put something in here like the protection of the environment as an example of that. We know that historically, the environment is an important element of First Nations' sense of being. And we know that a lot of people in the First Nations community put a lot of effort and focus into the environmental protections. There are non-First Nations people that also do that, so there is some shared, but it wouldn't be all non-First Nations people. Other people value the use of environment. So at times they are at odds. The values that they have are at odds. Are they more at odds or are they more similar? So do Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians share a sense of group values that define them as being Canadians, that we are all Canadians together? Or are there some things that they have values that are very different than Canadian, the larger Canadian or the majority Canadian values? That's question number 2. For question number 3 here, it's asking, how do Canadians help contribute to the understanding of our beliefs that are different from each other? So this isn't specific to First Nations just right now. You can think about what are the ways we use to learn about each other. Or share what's important. Just in general, what are the ways that we help each other, those that are different from us in our society? What are the ways that we help each other learn and understand who we all are and what our background is? If you looked at the whole of Canada, there are several different diverse groups that have different beliefs, different histories, different cultures, different expectations and habits. So how can we all interact with each other and help each other learn who we all are? What's the best way for us to understand and help each other understand each other's beliefs? That's the first part. That could be your part A. And then the second part, or an additional question related to that, is, for example, how do you think that Aboriginal people can help non-Aboriginal people understand their lifestyles and concerns? So how can First Nations people specifically help the larger society understand their needs or understand them in general? What's the best way for them to go about that? Because we have this thing called reconciliation, where we recognize as a country that there are some historical wrongs against First Nations people by members of the past, but that those consequences of those wrongs continue. And the goal of reconciliation is that we better understand each other. And part of that is that we recognize each other. So it can be the reason why, for example, you might invite some First Nations elders into your school to do a smudging of an area, or you might bring someone in to come and talk about a specific event that their family was part of, because then it's their first person or second person perspective or something like that, that they can specifically speak to an issue or a goal. So what are the ways that First Nations people can help the rest of us understand them and where they want to be in our society, how they want to be treated? Question 4, how can Canadians, either on their own or as whole communities, and if they're whole communities, they have a variety of beliefs, right? Because we're not a single culture, we are many cultures. So how can Canadians act ethically, cooperatively, and respectfully with these other cultures, and in particular with First Nations people? You know, how can Canadians show respect, I guess is what I'm asking, to First Nations people? What are ways that we can just make decisions or small actions that can contribute to this better relationship? If the goal is a better relationship, which I think should be the goal, or if the goal is also a healthier First Nations population or experience in Canada, and we know that it's not. Right? We know for a variety of reasons that there are people living more often. If you are First Nations, you have a higher likelihood of being involved in the justice system, a higher likelihood of being the victim of assaults. Specifically for First Nations women, you are more susceptible to assaults or potentially a victim of significant assaults or murder, missing, things like that. It's not a healthy experience as a whole for that whole community in Canada, really depending on the location that they come from. Some parts of the First Nations community in Canada are more wealthy or well off than other parts, and so there are a lot of factors that relate to that, right? So if the goal is we want a better relationship between First Nations people and non-First Nations people, and if we want a healthier experience for these people who are an important part of our country, how can we show respect to them? What are ways we can do that? How can we live together and still have some differences between us? For example, this live together thing, right now there is conflict, specifically between people in the oil industry versus people who are wanting to protect the environment and stopping that pipeline. There is conflict right there. What is a way that we can overcome these types of differences between us? That's question 4. And question 5, I guess it's kind of a loaded question. You could start by just taking the first word out and just answer, is equitable representation of First Nations voices and perspectives important for Canadians? Is it important that they are part of the story? You know, when we talk about history, for example, history was written by certain people, written by people in power, and it excludes the voices of many, right? There are many voices that aren't included in that written history or collection of history. Is it important that First Nations experience is part of Canada's story? And I would say that it is. So you can either answer this question, or you can answer the question that does start off with the why. If you accept that it is important, why is it important? That their unique experiences and perspectives are a part of our Canadian story and experience. Why is it important that we continue to include them in our national voice? And that should be a pretty reasonable question to understand, okay?